Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Hello. I'm Zinat Rahman, Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation between Congresswoman Liz Cheney and Harris School of Public Policy Dean Catherine Baker. Before one of our students formally introduces our guests, I just want to start with saying, acknowledging that today's Veterans Day, and I wanted to thank all of our veterans. So to all of our veterans in our military branches, thank you for your service. And everything you do to protect us. You've done your duty to your families, to your communities, to your fallen comrades, to your country. And today and every day, we know and we remember that our freedom is not guaranteed. It's provided to us by each one of you. So each one of the men and women in our armed services. So thank you all for that service. I want to mention a couple of upcoming events. On Monday, David Axelrod will moderate a discussion about the midterm elections, which will feature CNN political director David Chalian, Nsé Ufot, the former chief executive officer of the New Georgia Project, and IOP Pritzker fellow Laura Dove, who served as secretary for the majority under Senator Mitch McConnell. That event will be held in the Ida Noyes third floor theater starting at 5:30. On Tuesday, I'll be moderating an event called The Authoritarian's Playbook, which will explore how politicians use religious nationalism as a tool for power at times of oppression. So joining me for that panel will be IOP Pritzker fellow Rana Ayub, author and investigative journalist Catherine Stewart, and Elizabeth Shackman-Hurd, who's a professor of religious studies and political science at Northwestern University. That will be in partnership with the Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion, and they'll be in the Quad Club at 5:30, and you are welcome to register for either of those at our website. After today's moderated discussion, we'll open up the floor to take questions from you in the audience. Please line up to ask your questions at the microphone, which will be placed on the first floor. And as usual, if you've been here before, you've heard me say that we'll give priority to student questions. Please make sure your phones are on silent, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Chad Burkich, who will offer formal introductions of our speakers. Thank you. Welcome, Chad.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IOP Speaker Series. Today, we have in conversation with Representative Liz Cheney. My name is Chad Burkich. I am a third-year math major at the college. I am also the president of College Republicans this year. Our speaker today is Congresswoman Liz Cheney. She has served as representative for Wyoming's at-large district since 2017 and chaired the House Republican Conference from 2019 to 2021. Before her time in the House, Representative Cheney served in the State Department. She and Bill Kristol founded Keep America Safe, a nonprofit organization promoting national security in 2009. She is also the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney. Moderating the discussion today is Catherine Baker, Dean and the Emmett Dedman Professor at the Harris School of Public Policy. Before entering her current role, Dean Baker served as the C. Boyden Gray Professor of Health Economics in the Department of Health and Policy Management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. From 2005 to 2007, she served as a Senate-confirmed member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. After tonight's discussion, the IOP Student Advisory Board will be holding an event at the Institute of Politics House called Continuing the Conversation. The discussion will provide an opportunity for students to reflect on today's events. No RSVP is necessary. Just come by the house, which is at 5707 South Woodlawn Avenue, starting at 5 p.m. And it is my great honor to introduce Catherine Baker and Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I join the audience in being so excited to have the chance to talk with you, and there's a lot going on in the world.
There is, exactly.
So let me start by asking you some questions about what just happened in this week's election. You know, I think there was an expectation that there would be a bigger sweep for the Republican Party than there was. Does this suggest to you a change in the way people are viewing, bread and butter issues like abortion or inflation versus how they view the work of your committee, for example?
Well, I think, first of all, just let me echo what our speakers have said about wonderful to be here on Veterans Day and have the chance to thank everyone in our audience who served our nation for the fundamental defense of our freedoms. So thank you, and wonderful to be back at Chicago. Always. I spent many happy hours at the Oriental Institute just across the street. You could take 2 classes when I was at the law school, outside the law school, for credit, and I took Egyptian archaeology classes for both of those, and loved it. So anyway, it's wonderful to be back. And look, I think in terms of the election, the fact that we are here on Friday and we do not know which party is going to control the House or the Senate tells you a lot about defying expectations. I think about the extent to which it was a victory for Team Normal. I think you saw many candidates who were reflecting sort of the election denialism of President Trump rejected. Not all of them, and some races are still left to be called, but I think it was a really important and frankly hopeful outcome for democracy.
So it sounds like you're left feeling optimistic about the future of democracy. Can you make me feel better?
Well, look, I mean, I think we have a long way to go, and we certainly have a threat that we have never faced before in our country in terms of a former president who tried to overturn an election, tried to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, and who still is saying things that he knows caused violence on the 6th, and for whom there's still tremendous loyalty inside the Republican Party. And I think it's a dangerous moment. We have a lot to do, but I think that the outcome this week was certainly a step in the right direction, and a very important step in the right direction.
So given the fact that election deniers did not fare very well this week, do you feel like Trump's influence over the Republican Party is waning, or is it, if he announces, do you think he'll be a likely nominee?
Look, I think that, my view obviously was after January 6th, the party should clearly have said that is a line that can't be crossed, and should clearly have said, we're not going to be in a position where we're embracing insurrection or excusing it or whitewashing it. And so, I thought that was obvious, and certainly most elected officials in my party did not do that. People talk about Donald Trump these days as the biggest loser. And I think that's true if you look at the record from 2018, from 2020, from the special election in 2021, from 2022. So I think that's an important point. I also think, though, that as a party, we need to be clear that we should not be embracing him even if he were a winner, because what he's doing and what he advocates is so dangerous.
And it does seem like a fair number of stalwart supporters of the past turned away from President Trump with this week's election results. But there were a lot of people who started off repudiating election deniers who eventually came around to supporting them. Do you feel like there's a stiff enough spine in the party to stand up against future insurrections, or are we worried about January 6th, 2025?
No, we definitely need stiffer spines. I mean, that's for sure. And I think that elected officials need to understand that words matter. And when you sort of see again and again and again people accepting things that are indefensible, we watch what happens in our society, and when you accept things that you shouldn't, when you tolerate things like January 6th, then that can very easily become the new normal. Then it begins to be legal. And I think that's a big danger for us. And I think that, we need to make sure that with our votes, we are encouraging those people and supporting those people who will stand up for the Constitution.
So why do you think we're in the state of affairs that we are now? My sense is that it didn't used to be like this. The words used to matter more, and there used to be more of an impetus to reach across the aisle for either common sense regulation and law or pressing outside national interests, and that kind of bipartisanship we rarely see now. And as somebody who espouses evidence-based policy for a living, I have to say that sometimes it feels like people aren't really listening to evidence-based policy anymore. What happened?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, and I think here in Illinois, for example, anybody who hasn't been to the Abraham Lincoln Museum in Springfield should go. And there's an exhibit there that is very memorable because it's an exhibit where they flash sort of holograms on the walls of people in 19th century clothes. And as you walk through the exhibit, they're yelling things at you that they wrote to Abraham Lincoln. And they're really horrible. And so it's very impactful because you walk through and you realize, that it is not obviously sort of everybody in the past, and the horrific tragedy of our Civil War is certainly the worst example of this. But so we've had periods of time before where there was obviously vitriol and toxicity, and you can't say, well, it was always better. But I do think that we came through a period of time where, certainly when my dad was in Congress, and part of this was the families all moved to Washington during the school year, and so when you're face to face with people, when the families spend time together, it makes it much more difficult to get into these partisan battles where you say horrible things about each other. I think social media has made that much easier, and that level of toxicity is dangerous for a republic. And the lie about the election, that's a toxin in our system, in our blood system as a republic. And so I do think part of it is individual responsibility. Everybody has got to be in a position where we're taking responsibility for how we treat each other and for engaging based on substance and policy differences, and avoiding sort of the reflexive partisanship that can be dangerous at this moment.
Well, the January 6th Special Committee is obviously one of the mechanisms for reckoning with what happened, and I would imagine one of the goals is to prevent it from happening again. But what are you hoping the end product of the committee is? What are you hoping that we all take away, and what will we have to hold in our hands at the end of the year?
Well, I think a number of things. First of all, we are working on a report that's based on the evidence that we put forward in our hearings, as well as additional evidence. We'll talk about things like the security failure, like the extent to which there was clearly an intelligence failure. But as a committee, as we do that, there's one thing we will not do, and that is we will not blame the Capitol Police. We will not blame law enforcement for Donald Trump's mob armed that he sent to the Capitol to try to stop the electoral count. But you will see additional information in that report. And I think what we've done as a committee in terms of our hearings has been to put forward for people the evidence about the multi-part plan that Donald Trump himself oversaw and directed, each element of that plan in order to stop the peaceful transition of power. And there's so much information that I think it's really important for people to go back and watch the hearings if you haven't. And when the report comes out, to read the report and really to stop and think very carefully. We need to make sure we don't become numb to what Donald Trump did. And we need to make sure we remember that. And then we also will be proposing legislation. We've already proposed and passed in the House reforms to the Electoral Count Act and we'll have additional recommendations as well, and possibly criminal referrals too.
So you're still waiting to hear from Donald Trump. Do you think that he'll respond to the subpoena, and what will happen if he doesn't?
Well, he has a legal obligation. As I've said before, the committee has been in discussions with his counsel, but he has a legal obligation, like every citizen, to appear. And if he doesn't, and he's failed already to produce documents by the deadline, the committee will consider possible next steps. And separately, we're also obviously considering, as part of the report, criminal referrals.
So you've alluded to some of the legislation that might clarify the honorific role of the vice president in certifying results. What other things do you think need to happen at the federal or state level to help solidify the rule of law and the peaceful transition of power?
Well, as we talk about this, I think it's important, with respect to the Electoral Count Act, what President Trump encouraged Vice President Pence to do was illegal under the existing Electoral Count Act. It was also unconstitutional. So any suggestion that reforms are necessary to ensure that's illegal, which we've heard some people say, is simply not the case. But I do think it's important to be clear. For example, our legislation would raise the threshold necessary for objections. It also is very specific about the basis on which members of Congress can object. There seems to be some confusion. Some of it is willing confusion among members about their role and their responsibility. And the founders did not intend Congress to pick the president. And so, this notion that the Congress is some sort of court of last resort and can decide that we're going to throw out the votes of millions of Americans based upon allegations of fraud that have been rejected by the courts and rejected by the counts and the recounts at the state level, that's just clearly extra-constitutional. So we'll be very specific and clear about the basis on which objections can be made as well.
So thinking about how our system is intended to work and how it's set up, it seems as though our system of primaries and general elections has increasingly driven candidates from the fringes to be appealing during the primary and then failing to meet the needs of the majority of people who are less extreme in the general election. Your own experience illustrates this dynamic at play. Again, to my naive reading, it seems more extreme than before, that this trend has been amplified recently. Should we be doing something different systematically?
Well, I think, look, the power of individuals and the power of our votes is really significant and very important. And yes, we certainly have situations now where you have districts that have been drawn, so you end up with people that have sort of the most extreme views in too many cases on either side. And the incentive for elected officials is, the votes. And so I do think that, we need to think about getting back to a place where you're voting for candidates based upon substance and policy, responsibility. Look, I also think that, there are fundamental problems with the way that Congress works and doesn't work. There really are not a lot of incentives built in to try to work across the aisle, to try to find common ground where you can. It's sort of, constant campaigning and elections. And I think that, what we're seeing now as a result of the fact that we don't know who's going to be in the majority is particularly churn on the Republican side. I think that, we could well have a situation, if you think about how speakers are elected, on January 3rd, when the new Congress is sworn in, there'll be a roll call vote by, alphabetically, and members will have to stand and say, for whom they're casting their vote for speaker. And you could imagine a situation in our current environment where members at the beginning of the alphabet say Donald Trump. You don't have to be a member of the House to be speaker. And if people on the Republican side start standing up and saying Donald Trump, you could have, an impact where many people say that, and where Donald Trump will begin to view that as some sort of a loyalty test. That's the power that he is holding right now over Kevin McCarthy and over a number of members in the leadership of the Republican caucus.
So there are implications for governing of this kind of slim majority of Republicans in the House that is currently forecast. Kevin McCarthy has been pretty single-minded in his pursuit of that speaker role. How do you see his ability to implement an agenda in a very slim majority governed by some of the fringe elements of his own party?
Well, first he has to get the majority, which is not clear that's happened. Second, he has to get elected speaker, and I think Donald Trump may be his biggest obstacle to doing that. And then, I think that in the Republican Party in the House today, you have members who are very extreme. You certainly have people who are on the far left on the Democratic side, but our extreme members are going to be in a position where they can actually run things. And I think that is dangerous. And I think that if you just think about the kind of deal-making that they're demanding and insisting on, you can't conclude that that's good for the country.
So we used to think about threats to national security as being something that unites people across the aisle. It's a big day of news in a very long period of news for Ukraine. We have examples of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying we shouldn't be funding efforts to help Ukraine. How do you see national and international security policy under a scenario with a slim Republican majority taking shape?
Well, I think as a general matter, it's very important for the rest of the world to understand that, the United States of America has a functioning constitutional republic, that our democracy works, that they can count on us. And I do, as I said, I think that Tuesday was a step in that direction. I also think words really matter. And so when you have members on both sides suggesting that somehow the United States is not going to continue to provide assistance for Ukraine, that's bad policy, it's wrong, and it helps our adversaries. And so I think that I'm hopeful that, we will continue to see the kind of bipartisan support for that we've seen so far. I've been troubled by reports that the Biden administration is pushing the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. I don't think that that's our role. I think that's up to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, and they're right now engaged in an effort that has been more successful than anybody could have imagined. They've forced the Russians to retreat, and they deserve the world's support. They're on the front lines of freedom. So there should be no question about the message that goes out in terms of American support for the Ukrainian people, for their battle against the Russian invasion, and people should be clear that's going to be sustained no matter which party is in control.
So do you see promising examples of individuals reaching across the aisle now to push that kind of unified front?
I think so on Ukraine, certainly. I think it's been a real bright spot of bipartisan support, and certainly of international support for the Ukrainian people. And I think that obviously the Select Committee demonstrates that as well. I think it's been an education for each one of us on the Select Committee to have the chance to spend time working with people that we hadn't before. And it's been a really good lesson about being able to say, yeah, we disagree a lot on a lot of things, but we all as Americans can come together when it comes to the Constitution. And we also can have disagreements and discussions where we have debates that are civil. And I think people expect that, they should demand that. And we who our elected officials ought to conduct ourselves in a way that's worthy of that.
So your own leadership role in the Republican Party used to involve, characterizing the loyal opponents in the Democratic Party as people that you really disagreed with, and you were responsible for a lot of that rhetoric. Have your own views changed through your experience with colleagues on the Select Committee or through the things that have transpired over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think certainly, look, I think if you asked any elected official if they were being honest with you, they would say, and I certainly feel this way, absolutely, I have engaged in partisan politics in ways that, like, if I could take back some tweets, I would.
That's a problem with tweets.
Well, Twitter has other problems these days, too, but...
we'll get back to that, yeah.
So, look, and I really believe in, I think, everybody believes in really vigorous debate, and we ought to have vigorous policy debates. But I do think that after we saw what happened on January 6th, we all have to take a step back, and we all have to say, wait a minute, I can engage in a vigorous policy debate, but, what happened on January 6th was, a very clear effort by Donald Trump. In many ways, people believed him. They believed what he was saying was true, and he took people's patriotism in many cases and he launched it, as an attack against the Capitol. And I think that violence playing the role that it has come to play too often in our politics is something we all have to walk away from. And just, conduct yourself like your kids are watching. I think it's not complicated.
It seems as though people are living in very different realities, that the way we consume media, you mentioned Twitter and social media, and that people believed things that were just not supported by any evidence. It seems as though we're increasingly living in disparate media bubbles where you can live in a world that reinforces your own views over here, and I can live in a world that reinforces my own views over here, and they're increasingly separated from each other. Do you have any thoughts about what we should be doing as a matter of public policy to help bridge that and to help make it hard to propagate a falsehood on the American people? Yeah, it's a very important point, and it's very complicated. I think that it's certainly true that, we end up in these silos and we only get in information from people that agree with us. It's also certainly true that our adversaries are attempting to sow division and discord, and we see it. And recently, just in the last week, we had the head of the Wagner Group in Russia admit that they were attempting to interfere in our elections. And you see it in terms of, the Russian bots and the others online on all sides of these issues, just sowing discord. So I think that number one is individual responsibility. We have to be willing, and we have to take responsibility for saying, look, I need to know that what I'm consuming is truth, that it's factual. I need to test it out. I need to make sure that I'm not just hearing things that I want to hear and assuming that they're true. We also have to figure out what the rules of the road are for social media companies. And I don't mean, repealing Section 230. I think that they play a really important sort of a First Amendment role, and they're important platforms. But I think there has to be responsibility for things like the algorithms. And if the social media companies have algorithms that drive people to more and more radical places, I think they need to be accountable for that and responsible for it. So I think our laws haven't caught up with the role that social media is playing in our lives. And I just think that, when you hear that the leaders of these social media companies don't let their children on these platforms, that really tells you everything you need to know. And so this accountability would come to, would it come through regulation? Would it come through transparency to the populace and consumers? How do we bake that in?
Yeah, I think we need to look at all of those things. Again, keeping in mind the really important First Amendment issues here, but things like, the algorithms, regulating the algorithms, ensuring that, liability protections don't extend. If you've got algorithms, as an example, that drive people to terrorist financing sites, the companies have to be responsible for that. And I think that there's a role for Congress in deciding, what other very radical places and formula ought to be, for which there ought to be liability imposed.
I want to pick up on another thread you mentioned in terms of the role of gerrymandering in creating primaries that generate fringe candidates on both sides, and what you see as a public policy mechanism to address increasingly gerrymandered districts in lots of different states.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a really important question, and both sides do it. We've now, I'm not sure we know a good solution to it. Obviously states have different ways that they set up these districts. Some do it by legislature, some have separate commissions they establish. I don't know that you could look at one solution or the other and say that works better. I suppose it really, at the end of the day, it comes down to candidates. And the gerrymandered districts, the drawn districts, they don't always work the way that people think they're going to work. So I think, at the end of the day, people are they're going to elect, and they have the right to elect who they want to. We need to make sure they're a really good candidate so people have choices. I think we need to make sure that we're educated about how Congress really works. When you have Congress functioning where we get pieces of legislation that are, $1 trillion, and we have an hour of debate because there's no committee process, there's no markup, it comes out of sort of leadership on both sides. That's not how Congress ought to operate. And we've been trending in that direction, away from committee work, more towards leadership making those decisions, really since Newt Gingrich instituted that. And I think we need to reverse that and really go back to kind of a regular order legislative process.
You went out and stumped this cycle for a few Democratic candidates, who were in races against election deniers, and there were some real victories there, as we've said. That must have been a little surprising to you, as well as everybody else, that's where you ended up. Yeah. But do you see a place for people like you in the Republican Party going forward?
I hope so. Most of my career was outside of Congress, and so as I think about Congress and I think about the people who I respect, I do think about it from the context of if we weren't in Congress, who are the people that I would really be able to work with? Who are the people that I know are doing the right thing? And when I looked at that list, there's a group of women. I serve with most of them on the Armed Services Committee. And Abigail Spanberger, who's a former CIA officer. But these are women I don't agree with on a lot of issues, but I trust them. And I know, look, they're going to do the right thing, and they're going to be prepared, and they're going to do their homework. They care about their constituents. They care about the country. And we need that level of competence. And so in the case of Abigail Spanberger and Alyssa Slotkin, they were also running against opponents who had, in one form or another, embraced the big lie. And Abigail Spanberger's opponent had said January 6th was just the exercise of First Amendment rights. And so those were not tough decisions to make.
So what's next for you?
Obviously, I'm going to be working on the Select Committee and finishing out my time as Wyoming's representative, and then I'll make some decisions after that. As I said, Tuesday was a very good day, but this battle is far from over. And when I have said the most important thing is to make sure Donald Trump is nowhere near the Oval Office ever again, that commitment remains. so I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make sure that that's the case.
Well, it seems as though at the same time that Donald Trump's star fell this week, Ron DeSantis' star rose substantially. How do you see his role as the future potential leader of a Republican Party?
I think that the Republican Party has a lot of future potential leaders.
Diplomatically put, unsurprisingly. So we're going to turn shortly to audience questions, so you can get your questions ready. But before I do, I want to ask, there are a lot of people here who would like to make a difference in politics and public policy. Do you have advice for people who are interested in entering the political sphere to do productive things and to try to drive us towards a more substantive body politic?
Yeah, my advice is do it. You know, it can be easy to sit back and sort of, you know, be a little bit intimidated maybe by all of the different pieces of running for office, what's involved. But what I have learned, and you know what I knew, but we've all seen firsthand since January 6th, is having good, committed, responsible people in office is necessary for the survival of the republic. And so if you have at all any interest or you think you might be interested in running, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're smart and you're good and you're committed and you want to make sure that you're fighting for the Constitution, please run for office. We really need good candidates in office.
Do you see the opportunity to make a difference at state and local levels as well as in Washington? Where do you think
it's so important? Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at what's happening today, and people like Steve Bannon, frankly, have been very vocal about efforts to put candidates, you know, look at seats for which there aren't very many people running in local offices, on school boards, you know, committee precinct man and woman slots. And those offices really do matter. They're very, very important. And so it doesn't have to be running for national office, you know, or even state legislature, but every single office up and down the ballot, we need good people. So please, very important. So please run.
Well, with that call to action, we'll turn to the microphones to ask questions. I'm going to remind everyone there are a lot of people who'd like to ask questions, so please keep your questions brief. Questions should end with a question mark. Rhetorical questions have a place in class, but not here. So please ask your pithy question now, and I'm going to look to the microphones. There's one there and one over here. So giving people a second to sort. Please.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a second year in the college and an intern here at the IOP. I'm 20, and I have a question about voters like myself, young voters. In states like Pennsylvania, voters 18 to 25 voted for Democrats 70+% up. I'm asking a leader in the Republican Party what they think about Republican messaging towards young people. What's the strategy there? How do Republicans get young people to start voting for them in the numbers that they need to win? Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's really, it's a very important question. And I think that the fact that we had so many young people vote on Tuesday is a really positive thing. And I would say to young people, you know, there's a responsibility not just to kind of go with the flow. I know that on college campuses, it can be a lot easier to be a liberal. It can be a lot easier to vote for the Democrats. And I would say people need to educate themselves, need to think about what the issues really are, why, you know, why you're voting the way you're voting. I think that, you know, and you all know this better than I do. My sense is that young people aren't so much thinking about, should I be a Republican or a Democrat? I think, and I say this based on talking to my own kids and their friends, you know, it's much more, how can I make a difference? How can I do something that matters for my country and for the world? And so I think that, you know, it's less about Republicans figuring out, you know, how to get young people to vote Republican as a partisan matter, and more about being able to have the discussions about, well, you know, what does this candidate believe? And, you know, what do Republican policies mean in your life and for the life of the nation, and having the substantive discussions around issues that I think we all have to get back to. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for coming in today. My name is John Colettis, and I'm an editor for the Chicago Thinker. On the January 6th committee, you ally yourself with congressmen like Jamie Raskin, who decried the 2016 election as stolen and challenged former President Trump's victory. You have stated, and I quote, "If we elect election deniers, then we are really putting the republic at risk." Given your stated commitment to democracy, preserving our electoral legitimacy, and your opposition to election denial, how do you justify your collaboration with Jamie Raskin and other January 6th committee members who rejected the 2016 election?
Well, I think it's an important point. I think that, as I said earlier, I don't believe that Congress has any role in objecting to electoral votes. And I think that, when Democrats did it, it was wrong. When the Republicans did it, it was wrong. And so my view about the Constitution is very clear. With respect to that committee, I think your question is mostly about sort of is the committee partisan? And I have to tell you that it's the most nonpartisan committee I've ever served on. And it is a committee where, look, we don't agree on everything. You mentioned Jamie Raskin, who's become a very good friend of mine. Jamie thinks we should abolish the Electoral College. I think that's wrong. And so there are a lot of issues, even outside the committee, that we don't agree on. But we agree on the most important thing. And when I see my fellow Republicans and my fellow conservatives who tried to prevent the investigation of the attack, who all knew in the days just after the 6th, and they all said so, this was wrong. Kevin McCarthy said Donald Trump bears responsibility. They all knew it was wrong. And then slowly it became too uncomfortable. And so the effort started to whitewash what happened and not to investigate. I mean, just think about that. The attack on this committee is that we're partisan. Well, the very first thing that was proposed by Kevin McCarthy, which was a bipartisan commission. We then negotiated with the Democrats. We said to the Democrats, all right, we're going to have a bipartisan commission. These are the terms. We want every member not to be a sitting member of Congress. We want equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. We want equal subpoena power, equal division in the staff among Democrats and Republicans. And you know what the Democrats said to us? Done. You got it. You know what Kevin McCarthy did? He said, never mind, I'm walking away. And he pulled his support from that bipartisan commission. Then it passed the House anyway. 35 Republicans voted for it. It went over to the Senate, and Mitch McConnell killed it in the Senate. So then you're in a situation where you say to yourself, all right, the bipartisan commission has now been killed. How could we as a Congress decide we're not going to investigate this attack? And so Speaker Pelosi said, all right, we're going to put forward a resolution. The resolution passed, created the committee. Speaker McCarthy named 5 Republicans to the committee, 2 of whom were totally unfit for service on this committee. And Speaker Pelosi said that. She asked me if I agreed with her before she said it. I said, yes, I do agree with you. So she rejected 2 of his 5, and then Kevin McCarthy pulled all of his 5. So it cannot be that we can't investigate the worst attack on the Capitol since the War of 1812 because the minority leader decided that he was going to walk away from the investigation. And everybody should ask themselves, it's not complicated. Just think for a minute. Why don't the Republicans want the attack of January 6th investigated? Just ask that question. So I am very proud of the work of this committee and of the role that I've played in helping to make sure the American people know the truth about what Donald Trump did and how uniquely dangerous it was and remains to the Republic.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you.
Hi, Congressman Cheney. Thank you for your loyal opposition at a great personal cost. and loyal opposition for me is the foundation of democracy. So if success is how much you bounce back when you hit button, has democracy already hit button and is about to bounce back? And amid all the fatalistic warning about the fragility of democracy, how democracy die, or the twilight of democracy, are we confident at this moment to make a case for the resilience of democracy? And what would you want to say about that?
Thank you. It's a very important point. I think that I would say first that there are elections that haven't yet been decided that are really important in this regard. What happens in Arizona, what happens in Nevada, those elections will determine whether or not we have put people in office who have told us they won't respect the results of future elections in states that are very important for the 2024 presidential race. So the threat remains, but nobody should bet against democracy. And I think that what we're seeing and what showed up in the results on Tuesday is that the majority of the American people, regardless of party, do not want to watch the Constitution be torched, and will stand up against that. And I think it was really a heartening thing to see. And again, I think it's very clear we all have an obligation. You can't sort of sit back and say, okay, the threat's passed. It hasn't. But we also need to know that our democracy, while fragile, has survived, for 246 years, and with the commitment of the majority of the people who believe in our constitutional foundation, it will continue to survive and thrive for many, many more.
First of all, it's an honor to speak with you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. I'm Lucy. I'm 18, and I'm a first year at the college. So I would like to ask, personally, as a native Puerto Rican, every election season, I see the results of my local election and wonder why, as an American citizen, I cannot vote or have equal representation when living on the island. With your experience as an attorney and consultant, as well as a U.S. Congresswoman, why do you think the U.S. Congress hasn't offered PR a yes-no vote referendum on statehood as they did for Alaska and Hawaii in the 1950s?
They should, and I believe that Puerto Rico should be a state. I think that it's really important to look at the commitment of members on both sides on this issue. Puerto Rico is currently represented, I'm probably going to hurt her if I say this, but I'm already halfway there, currently represented by one of the most effective members of Congress, in Jennifer Gonzalez. She's really wonderful and works incredibly hard. And I think has been one of the most effective advocates for Puerto Rican statehood, certainly of anybody that I've ever talked to about it. And so Puerto Rico is very well represented, and I believe in statehood.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Congresswoman Cheney. Thank you for being here. My name is Arthur Long, and I'm a third year in the college. You've said in the past that you're a classical Republican, a defender of limited, accountable government, and that your goal is to defend democracy. Surely democracy means that we, the people of the United States, are the ones who choose who will sit in the Oval Office. How, then, is that consistent with your stated goal to, quote, do whatever it takes to make sure Donald Trump isn't anywhere near the Oval Office? Thank you.
It's precisely because I care so deeply for our democracy, and precisely because I believe so strongly that we, the people, have to speak. And as I watch what's unfolding in my party, and as I watch people who know better suggest that they could support him again, the democracy cannot survive a president who's willing to blow through all the guardrails of that democracy. And I say this as somebody who voted with Donald Trump 93% of the time. I am a conservative Republican. I am more conservative than most of the members of my conference who are now suggesting that they're going to support Donald Trump for president again. This is not about policy. But I also know the incredible power that we entrust to our presidents. And when you entrust that power, and when someone swears an oath, and the president's oath in particular, to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed, brings with it an obligation to defend all the branches of our government, brings with it a particular obligation to defend how our government functions, and brings with it an obligation to, as all citizens have, abide by the rulings of the courts. So when you have a president who ignores the rulings of the courts, who ignores the legitimate outcome of an election, who knows that there is a mob that he has summoned that is angry and is armed, and sends them to march on the Capitol to stop the counting of electoral votes, to stop the peaceful transfer of power, that's a danger that we can't sustain. You know, we entrust our president with these things. And I ask people to think about, because sometimes when you talk about what Donald Trump did, we do all become numb. So think about if Dwight Eisenhower had summoned a mob to Washington, an armed mob, and sent them to march on the Supreme Court during the arguments on Brown v. Board. And then when the mob was there attacking the court, refused to tell them to leave, and instead sent a message further inciting them. It is completely unimaginable, because Dwight Eisenhower was an honorable man. He never would have done anything like that. But if you disagree with everything else that I've said about the outcome of the election and the rulings of the courts and the process by which the election was conducted, if you disagree with all of that, think to yourself, what kind of human being sits in the dining room next to the Oval Office and watches the violent assault on television? And there are Capitol Police officers here today who fought that battle. It was medieval, armed, hand-to-hand combat. Look at the video. Donald Trump sat and watched that. People came in and pleaded with him and said, you are the only one. You have to tell them to go home. And he wouldn't do it? What kind of a human being is that? And so I understand the threat of a president who won't honor our elections and the sanctity of our election process. And that person can never be president again. You can disagree with me, but I am never going to change my view on that.
Good afternoon, Congresswoman. My name is Christopher Phillips, and I'm a second year at the college. My question for you today is, on January 5th and 6th, 2021, a man named Ray Epps was recorded countless times encouraging people to storm the Capitol, saying, quote, "We need to go into the Capitol, that's where our problems lie," end quote. He was also present on the front lines during the initiation of the attack. An alert was made by the FBI for Epps shortly after the events of January 6th, but shortly thereafter, the alert was rescinded. Epps was interviewed by the January 6th committee twice. So while men such as William Leary have been arrested and imprisoned without even entering the Capitol, why is Epps still walking the streets today? Why did the January 6th committee not recommend his arrest?
Well, first of all, the January 6th committee does not arrest people or recommend arrest. We're a member of the legislative body. Law enforcement and arresting people is the obligation, the responsibility of the Justice Department. The conspiracy theory about Ray Epps is just a lie. It's just not true. There's a conspiracy theory. Obviously, I've seen it out there, and it's one of those pieces of what we've seen around January 6th that is pushed by people that want to suggest that this attack was something other than what it really was. So I can tell you that the committee has interviewed Mr. Epps. The Justice Department has been very clear that Mr. Epps has no connection to being under their employment, did not on January 6th. They've done everything possible, as has the committee, to put to rest this conspiracy theory. And in fact, I think Mr. Epps's life, has really, he's faced tremendous threat. His family has faced tremendous threat because of this lie. And I would ask, this goes back to the question about what do we do about social media. And I think that it's just incredibly important to question conspiracy theories like this, because the conspiracy theories are being pushed and promoted, and it's disinformation. It's just simply not true. And I think it's really important for people to question why these conspiracy theories are out there. And I hope you've watched our hearings. And I think that if you watch the hearings, go back and watch the summaries of the hearings, it's very clear that there was a premeditated plan by Donald Trump to declare victory no matter what the outcome was. He then corruptly attempted to pressure state officials to change the outcome in their states. He, attempted corruptly to change the leadership at the Department of Justice, because the Department of Justice was telling him there is not fraud here sufficient to overturn the election. He didn't like that answer. He went to find people who would give him the answer he wanted. His own campaign was telling him that. His White House counsel was telling him that. He attempted to corruptly pressure the vice president. And then he summoned the mob and sent them to the Capitol and didn't tell them to stand down. So I think that all of those pieces, and I would also just, another important point about our hearings is the vast majority of the witnesses, if you don't like my view of Donald Trump or you don't believe me, the vast majority of our witnesses are Republicans. They're people that he appointed or people in his own family who've come forward and testified about what was happening in that period of time. And it's really important to watch those and ask yourself what really happened here and how can we protect ourselves. Thank you.
Hi, Congresswoman Cheney. I'm Mitch Robson with the Chicago Thinker, and thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask, in an effort to win your primary, you put out a campaign ad featuring your father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, who, in his condemnation of former President Donald Trump, said that, quote, "a real man wouldn't lie to his supporters." Now, as many will recall, your father stated as unequivocal truth narratives that at the time were discredited or disputed by U.S. intelligence to justify a bloody war with Iraq, whether, a war that killed hundreds of thousands and more than the undoubtedly awful storming of the Capitol, whether it was claiming that 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta met with Iraqi intelligence in Prague, that Saddam Hussein had an established operational relationship with al-Qaeda, or that Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And the revelation of the falsity of these narratives led public trust in government to plummet. So how do you respond to those who believe your father's actions during his tenure as vice president eroded this trust that he holds so highly?
They're wrong. Look, I obviously disagree with your characterization of the policies of the Bush administration and of the Iraq War, and I'm happy to have those discussions with you about that. And I think that there's also, it's important to have some facts undergirding that discussion as well, including the fact that you had senior leaders in al-Qaeda, including the number 2 in al-Qaeda, who'd been given safe haven in Iraq after 9/11 for years. So that's one part of what you laid out, the notion that there's no connection between Saddam Hussein and the leaders of al-Qaeda. The extent to which Saddam Hussein violated multiple, I can't remember the number now, 12 or 13 United Nations National Security Council resolutions. The extent to which it was very clear, despite efforts since then to change the narrative, that there were in fact connections between Saddam and al-Qaeda. And certainly, I can go on and on again about your characterization of the policy. I would say that there's a big difference between debates about policy, which we have to have in a democracy, and a president who, and think about this, Donald Trump knew more than probably just about any other American about the results of the election. And one of the most important pieces of our hearings is a comparison that we put together that you'll see in the report as well that shows specific allegations Donald Trump was making, whether it was about the suitcases in Georgia or about ballot dumps in Antrim County. Specific allegations, testimony by his attorney general, his deputy attorney general, his campaign manager, telling him those are not true, along with dates, and then Donald Trump says them again. So time and time again, Dominion voting machines, time and time again, he's shown the evidence, he's shown that it isn't true, and he goes out and he says it again. And one of the things that's been interesting is that as the Select Committee has aired our hearings, it's clear that, people in the Justice Department who were telling Donald Trump, this isn't true, this is not true, they didn't know that people in his campaign were telling him the same thing. But they were all telling him it's not true. So it's not true, and 61 out of 62 courts, including many with judges that he appointed, told him, look, no, there's no evidence, I'm not going to throw out the votes, you're making these claims of fraud. He was making the claims of fraud publicly, and then his lawyers either wouldn't make those same claims in court, or in the case of Rudy Giuliani, did and lost their law license. So, he went through every single process in our system, and he had the right to do that up until the courts ruled, and up until December 14th. But once the Electoral College has met, that's it. That's the end. And he knew that he was being told that these claims weren't true. He admitted that he knew that he had lost on more than one occasion. And yet, he betrayed the trust of his supporters. And I think that's the thing that is really important for people to understand, that people believed him and people still believe him. And that is just a disgraceful tragedy, because what he's saying is absolutely false. What he's saying about the January 6th committee, what he's saying about the people that are have been jailed because of January 6th. I mean, let me think about this. We have people who have pled guilty to seditious conspiracy. That's not the January 6th committee saying people committed seditious conspiracy. That's not the Justice Department saying it. It's individuals who've said, yeah, I'm guilty. I'm pleading guilty to seditious conspiracy, which means, among other things, an attempt to use violence to overthrow the government of the United States of America. That is the worst thing. So I think it's really important to separate out policy disputes and disagreements from a president who's attempting to undermine the Constitution.
Yes, of course. Do you mind if I just ask to
Thanks.
clarify?
I think we're going to go to the next question. Thank you.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you for being here today. My name is Frances Kavanaugh. I'm a graduate student at the Harris School. During his presidency, Reagan said that there's only one Berlin, and that we in the West should resist Soviet expansion. Given the international interconnectedness in terms of trade, energy, manufacturing, and rising tensions in the East and South China Sea, what do you make of recent U.S. strategy in the region, and what do you think the future of U.S.-led, principle-driven coalition building in the Pacific looks like?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that administrations of both parties have gotten China wrong. And I think that you had for a long time this belief, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, this idea that if the West helped China to open up economically, if we helped them become members of the World Trade Organization, that they would be forced to open up politically. And part of why that was so wrong, I think, is the rise of technology and the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to use technology to impose a surveillance state in China. And they have, for a long time, understood that the United States of America is the leader of the free world. They believe that their own success demands and depends upon their defeat of us. And they've been working to do that, using every tool at their disposal, not just sort of the increase that we've seen in military spending and the deployment of new weapon systems. And while they've been doing that, we have not understood that for too long. I think that we have not understood, we haven't realized the threat that they pose. I think today, one of their messages to countries across Asia is, the United States has got so many problems, you can't count on them. I mean, you see this in the open source reporting that they're suggesting that democracy is somehow at an end. And so I do think it's very important for us, number one, to be realistic about the threat that we face. And it's not just China. China is a very significant threat, but so is Iran and North Korea, Russia. And all of those threats become interconnected if they think America is weak or distracted or we won't defend our allies. And I think, and I say this to all of the students in the room, if you have the chance to study deterrence strategy, please do. It's an area of study that we really focused on during the Cold War. How do you deter other nations from using their weapons against us? And it's an area that has fallen out of favor, but we really need it. And it has to inform our force posture. It has to inform what kinds of weapon systems we invest in. It has to inform our level of military spending. And there's just no question that America's got to realize and recognize that a world in which China gets to set the rules is a global surveillance state. Freedom cannot exist in that world. And that's what's on the line. And we have to make sure that we are doing much better at meeting and defeating that challenge.
Thank you.
Hi there, Congresswoman. My name is Christina Matisik. I'm a second-year master's student at the Harris School of Public Policy. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
You mentioned voters should have good candidates to choose from. Given the polarization within the Republican Party, do you think Americans are ready for a third major party?
Well, I think that there are more Republicans talking about that possibility than you've ever seen before. I think if Donald Trump becomes the nominee of the Republican Party, the party will shatter. And I think the question is for the Republican Party and for my fellow Republicans. Are you willing to stand up for the truth? Are you willing to get back to providing to the voters policy and substance and the basis on which people should vote for us? Or are you going to become a cult of personality? And so I guess the answer to that is we don't know for sure yet how this is going to unfold. I think that our system is structured for two parties, and I hope that the Republican Party can climb back from where it is today. I think it's much better for the country if it can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Daniel Schmidt. I'm a second year. I actually hope to run for office someday, so it's great to talk to a sitting representative. Really is an honor.
Good. You just have about 6 more weeks.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, I appreciate it. But listen, so I've been following this January 6th committee really closely, and I just wanted to ask you about, some of the facts here. So on June 9th, you cited the Department of Justice and their prosecution of the Proud Boys, some of the members of the Proud Boys, and the Department of Justice said these members directed, mobilized, and led members of the crowd onto the Capitol grounds and into the Capitol. So obviously that's a crime, that's insurrection, and I guess you made the right call there. The fact of the matter is we have another person on camera doing exactly that. His name is Ray Epps, and it's not a conspiracy theory. The New York Times shows him saying, quote, "We need to go into the Capitol. I'm going to pick it out there. I'm going to put it out there. I'm probably going to go to jail. Tomorrow we need to go into the Capitol." That's not a conspiracy theorist. We have an actual insurrectionist on tape, and yet he's escaped prosecution. So let me just ask you right here, do you demand the prosecution of Ray Epps? He's an actual insurrectionist on tape. Do you demand his prosecution?
Let me answer the question, because I think there's some confusion about the role of Congress, and confusion about who makes decisions about prosecutions. I don't think anybody has denied that videotape exists. I've seen the videotape. I've seen thousands of people saying things like, "Let's go into the Capitol." You've seen trials of a number of people who did go into the Capitol. You've seen convictions of thousands of them. So I think the question is, whether or not you understand who makes prosecution decisions. And the people who make the decisions about whether they're going to prosecute or not are at the Department of Justice. Now, in terms of what I've seen, and in terms of what we've said, in terms of what the Department of Justice has said, Mr. Epps, there are conspiracy theories around the role that he was playing that day. People are pushing this notion that somehow he was doing what he was doing because the federal government was telling him to. That's not true. There's no evidence of that. And the Justice Department and the committee have both said that clearly. But I would say that if you're so concerned about violent acts at the Capitol on the 6th and about insurrection, it is really worth looking at the transcripts of some of these hearings and looking at what the judges have said. Nobody should use violence to attempt to overturn the government. Nobody should have used violence at all in our politics. Nobody should have summoned a mob to Washington, D.C. and sent an armed mob to attack the Capitol. And I think we all ought to be able to agree on those basic things as Americans, and set aside conspiracy theories and agree fundamentally on what is the line in our democracy that can't be crossed. And that line has got to be, you cannot use violence to attempt to overturn an election. If you're the President of the United States, you have to guarantee the peaceful transition of power. And we have to be a nation of laws. And it's not a partisan issue.
Thank you. We have time for one last question on a new question. Yes?
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
I appreciate your I appreciate your handling of and apologize for Daniel Schmidt's behavior. He's the worst our campus has to offer. My question for you tonight is, we've talked extensively about social media and the problems that it poses for our democracy. So the increase in polarization is not the only consequence. We see increasing suicide rates, increasing anxiety rates among young people as a direct result of social media, Liz. And this is one of the biggest problems I think is facing our country. I want to know, what are you going to do about social media? How are you going to get kids off of social media? And do you support policy to get kids off of social media? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I'm a mother, and I understand what social media can do and what it does. And I understand the stresses and the pressures that young people face today in our society. And I think that there are many things that have to be done. Some of them have to be done at the federal level. Some of them have to be done in communities. I think that we need to train people to recognize and understand danger signs among young people. We need to do a better job at training ourselves, at training teachers, at training community leaders when they see behaviors that clearly are putting people at risk. And again, I think that these social media companies, I mean, I think the numbers that we've seen, particularly for Instagram, and what that has done in terms of young people, young girls especially, is something that we can't sustain. And so I don't know what all of the solutions are. I know that as a parent, well, just as a parent first, it's an issue that I care very deeply about. I think every parent does. And I think that, I think, it's an issue that I've worked on the Armed Services Committee, because we've seen increases in levels of veteran suicides as well. And I think one of the big things that we need to confront is the stigma around mental health. I think there are too often veterans who are afraid of seeking help because they think it will show up in their record and it'll be detrimental. And it's not just veterans. I think that there's still a stigma about mental health. I think we've made a lot of progress in terms of helping to eliminate that, but the support has to be there. People have to know that they can seek help. And we have to find the things in society, like the social media platforms, that are contributing to depression and to other concerns among young people, and do everything we can at every level to help protect our young people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Congresswoman Cheney for a truly illuminating afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.